Hello, good evening. Are we on? I don't even know. Good evening and welcome to this live stream. Oh, no, not yet. Hello, good evening. Welcome to this special Vancouver Writers Festival event from cyberspace and Vancouver. My name is Marsha Lederman. I'm going to be speaking with Vancouver physician and author Daniel Kalla, who is here as well. Hi, Dan.
Hi.
First and foremost, I'd like to acknowledge that this event is taking place not just in virtual space, but that we are on the unceded ancestral lands of the Squamish, Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh people, and we are very grateful to be on this land. I am coming to you from my home in East Vancouver, and Dan is coming to you from his home in somewhere else in Vancouver. I don't even know where he lives, but I've never done one of these, so cross your fingers for me. There is a slight possibility my cat may make a cameo at some point. So here's how the event will go. We're going to have a brief reading from Dan and some questions from me, and then we'll get to some questions that were submitted. And there's also a way for us to get further questions from you, and we will ask those later during the event. A brief introduction. Daniel Kalla was born and raised in Vancouver. He went to medical school at UBC, where he is now associate clinical professor. He's head of the emergency department at St. Paul's Hospital, and he is also a prolific and best-selling author. His 11th novel, which is just being released this month, is The Last High. It takes place in Vancouver, and it deals with the opioid crisis, and in this case involving a particularly lethal influx of drugs. We're also going to talk about his first published novel, Pandemic. You can guess why. A new mysterious killer flu emerges from a Chinese province, and the World Health Organization swoops in to investigate. And we'll also discuss his novel from last year, 2019, which feels like it was about 40 years ago now. It's called We All Fall Down, and it also deals with the pandemic. In that case, the return of the plague, the Black Death. And clearly these books have resonance for all of us, and certainly for Dan, who is an emergency room doctor. And I also want to say before we kick off that today is International Nurses Day. And if there are any nurses watching, if you're kicking back, thank you, truly, sincerely. Thank you. So Dan, I want to start by asking how you're doing right now. Are you working? I mean, you're not working right now, but you are working.
In general, I'm working. And thank you, Marsha. I'd like to reiterate to the nurses across the world have been heroic in what's gone on with the coronavirus. And, particularly here, our nurses are always awesome and have risen to the challenge as always. So, yeah, I agree. But, weirdly, we've done so relatively well in BC and Vancouver compared to other places, and the emergency departments are very quiet because people are staying away. They're almost staying away too much. We worry, that some of the sicker patients aren't coming because of their fear of COVID. But it's business as usual for us at the emergency department. Just extra precautions,
Oh, that's interesting. So the threat I've been using to my 11-year-old, don't do that because this is a terrible time to go to the emergency room, is not valid. Is that what you're telling me?
No.
Okay. I imagine your day job must bleed into your writing. Was that the case for The Last High?
Yeah, I don't think, despite the titles you alluded to, I don't think there's ever been a book where there's been so much overlap. I've been at St. Paul's, anybody in Vancouver knows that that's the downtown hospital that services some of our most disenfranchised and much of the downtown east side population. And, we've been dealing with the opioid crisis in the 20 years I've been there, 21 years I've been there, the whole time, but it's gotten so much worse in the last 5 or 6 years with the advent of these very potent opioids like fentanyl and all the others.
So before we get into a big discussion about the book, it might be a good time for you to do a reading. You're going to read from the prologue?
Yeah, it sets the stage for one of the important messages that I'm trying to establish in this novel that we can talk about afterwards. But sure. So I'll start with the prologue. The house music courses through Alexa. The hypnotic beat and melting layers of sound feel as if they come from within, as if her heart is the amplifier. And the warmth is so enveloping, like being lowered into the most perfect bubble bath. The bliss is almost unbearable. Alexa can't lift her head off her chest, but she can move her eyes. With a quick sweep of the room, she sees all the friends who matter most to her: Rachel, Nick, Joshua, Grayson, and Taylor. The only ones who matter at all, really. Taylor, her very best friend, is slouched at a weird angle on the couch beside her. Taylor had promised to ensure Alexa got some alone time with Josh at the party, even though she has a crush on him too. Typical Taylor, always putting her friends first. Her eyes are still open, but the pupils are tiny as pinholes, and her complexion, it's grayish blue, while her lips have turned almost purple. So strange, but so beautiful. Alexa shifts her gaze to the left and sees Josh and Gray sprawled out on the other couch, propped up only by their abutting shoulders. Josh's eyes are as glassy as Taylor's, while Gray's are shut altogether. They're both so still, and Josh's exposed arm are mottled deep dark blue. Alexa wishes she could tell him how much she loves him. Tonight was supposed to be the night. Alexa looks down at her own hands. Her fingers feel foreign to her, and the color of her nails match those of Taylor's lips. She knows it's not right, but it's so wild. The floating warmth intensifies. Alexa feels as though she's falling off the couch even though she's not moving. She's never drunk anything more than a beer or two in her 16 years. How could one cup of Nick's punch make her so woozy? Something in the back of her brain, she can hear her mother's panicked voice, a distant scream, telling her to breathe. But her mom's nowhere near the party. Alexa finds it all kind of funny. She wants to laugh. She wants to tell Taylor how exquisitely wrong it all is. But she can't even move her lips. Besides, dreams are stealing over her now, and she can't hold on any longer.
Wow.
So,
Thanks, Dan.
no problem. Thank you.
It's interesting that the book starts off with a group of teenagers who overdose on a very potent drug that we assume is fentanyl, but we learn more about it later on. Did you go with teenagers as the first victims intentionally? Because this is obviously not something that I think or that you think, but one of the characters in the novel talks about, you know, it's natural selection. People who are doing these drugs are, you know, we don't care about them. They're homeless people. They're on the downtown east side. They're drug addicts. But once it hits home with a group of nice teenagers, suddenly it's a different story. Was that intentional on your part?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, that's a great point, Marsha. As I said, one of the messages that we really want to establish is that fentanyl and opioids touch everybody. And, you know, so there's really, to get into the meat of it right from the top, that, you know, the two main messages is just how pervasive and the damage this does. And the fact that, you know, those people on the downtown east side, I've got to know many of them. They started off as beautiful teenagers. Nobody chooses to end up living in alley as a hardcore drug addict. I mean, you know, it's drug addiction, like any addiction, is an inheritable disease, and I really think should be treated as such, not a stigma, not a criminal offense. You know, they're as much part of a society as anybody else. You know, at least they begin that way before they get so disenfranchised. So yeah, the two, you know, but you're right. I wanted to make it dramatic, and I wanted this book to be a cautionary tale for parents, for teenagers, for other people that trying, and you know, it gets established early. They didn't even realize they were trying opioids. They were spiked. But even if they did, there's a lot of people who think they can dabble once with it, but the risks are so great, and you know, it's really So that's, I'm trying to reach everybody. And I thought the easiest way is to show some really vulnerable teenagers and what the damage that could be done.
Because you think as a parent, you know, I'm sure you were perfect growing up, but I did some pretty stupid things. And now a teenager doing stupid things, it could be lethal.
Yeah, I mean, totally. And that's the thing, right? And of course, teenagers, that's what you're supposed to do as a teenager is stupid things, right? But unfortunately, you know, when I was a teenager, and even if I had tried heroin, which I didn't, but if I did as a teenager, the risk to me would have been there, but nothing like some of the fentanyls and some of the fentanyl analogs, the super opioids that are on the street. I mean, it's the difference between playing with firecrackers and playing with dynamite. And people need to know that what's out there and the complete lack of quality control. And, it's, it's truly a loaded gun.
It's very frustrating for me, not just for me, but especially for my colleagues at the Globe and Mail in British Columbia. I don't even think I introduce myself. I write for the Globe and Mail in BC about arts. But I see my colleagues who report on this catastrophe who deal with, I'll have to say, a disinterest that people aren't engaged in this because they feel it's not about them. It doesn't affect them. And it is maddening to me. It must be for you too. You are treating these people.
Very much so. I mean, as we talked about, you can't paint them with one brush, but even if you could, they got there in stages, and like I said, nobody would choose to end up as the worst, the most IV dependent opioid user out there. It's a miserable life, and we get to talk to these people and get to know some of them well at St. Paul's, and they come from all walks of life, and many of them are intelligent, artistic, kind. I've seen the acts of compassion I've seen between some of the homeless drug users in the downtown east side. It's striking what they will do and what they're willing to offer each other, and and their gratitude for a kind word from you. So there's that alone, and it's just not true. The tainted fentanyl gets into the cocaine supply, gets into other drug supply that people that we do care about or do know might be dabbling in. It's just not limited to any one segment of society, and you can't compartmentalize it that way, and it's not fair to. I mean,
And even if it were, it makes it no less important, right? I mean, 100%. I think that's the key message. Yeah. So at what point in treating these cases did you think, oh, maybe I'm going to write about this, fictionalize this?
Yeah. Well, that's, for me, that's been my way. I don't really write nonfiction per se, and I don't have much of a soapbox to stand on. And, growing up, I loved, my favorite authors were like the James Mishners, the people that taught you something and entertained you at the same time. And so this was obviously, I mean, I guess I'm sounding pretty vehement, but it's a subject I feel strongly about. But I also know it's so rife with drama and the potential for telling a story. And so I'd been thinking about it for a few years, but, finally a couple of years ago, sat down to assemble the story and, and really delve into it. And the other thing is, I realized after 20 years of working that I understood opioid overdoses inside and out. I know what they did to people. I knew the medical side. What I knew nothing about was the criminal side. Where do these drugs come from? How do they circulate? How are they distributed? I knew nothing. And fortunately, I had a friend who was an undercover cop in the greater Vancouver area who became my consultant and my guru and really opened up the world of the drug trade and drug trafficking in Vancouver. And by Vancouver, it could be any city, right? To me, but it's fascinating, and that became as much of an interest to me, as, if not more so, than the medical side. And as you know, having read it, that probably spends more time on the streets and the back alleys and the mansions where a lot of these the heads of these gangs live, and and that was really important to me because I never understood, Marsha, and I know and I'm sure you've thought about. I never understood how you can start selling a product that is going to kill so many of your clients, like. What brings people to that point? I mean, even if you have no conscience and no morality, what's the business sense of putting out a product that's going to kill your recurrent client. I never understood that, and I kind of try to tackle that issue in this book a little bit too.
It's really interesting how you do that, because everyone feels like they're just a cog in the wheel, and they don't feel responsible. There's a whole system, there's the manufacturer, there's the importer, the supplier, the dealer, and everyone can say, oh, I'm not really the guilty party. It's that guy over there. Again, was that an intentional theme on your part?
Yeah. I've written these novels, these thrillers would have these big central conspiracy and these sort of brilliant cabals to a degree behind them. But the more I learned from my friend in law enforcement, the more I read, I realized, one of the underpinnings of the whole criminal community here is their short-sightedness, their greed, and I hate to say it, but a lot of their stupidity, right? And so to me, I didn't want any criminal mastermind behind it. I wanted a lot of greedy, stupid, amoral people, just to show what could happen. And, to them, the profit is right there. And, as when I talk about in the book, the profit from fentanyl is so much higher than heroin, because a kilo of heroin, which is harder to get in the country, sells for 70 or 80,000 on the street, and a kilo of fentanyl sells for $1.6 million. So of course, they're moving to that new product. Damn the consequence. Who cares how many people are going to die along the way? So I really wanted it to be realistic and show these criminals for what they are, just self-serving, not very intelligent, and certainly they don't give an F about their clients and what's happening. They figure there's always a steady stream of new ones.
Were you able to meet anyone in the supply chain, or was your undercover cop friend able to connect you with anyone?
No, because I'm way too big a coward to do that. But first of all, he had such, he should be a writer himself, because he had such incredible stories that added such clout and street cred. I learned all the you call a dealer a plug, you call somebody who manufactures a cook. Like, I learned all the terminology from him, and I'd watch interview with people some criminals, and I read some stories online. I didn't meet any person. I didn't really think I needed to. And to be honest, I've met several in the hospital, because as much as we get the dealers are often using themselves, and so I've met several of them, dealt with several of them in the emergency department.
Do you have anything prescriptive to offer about the fentanyl crisis? Is there something we should be doing that we're not? Well, clearly there's something we should be doing that we're not.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we're doing, clearly, if you look at our data, I mean, we've 12,000 Canadians have died in the last 3 years from opioid overdose. Their average age is the mid-30s. The years of lost life are staggering. But BC, if we look specifically at BC, has done a lot of interventions. The government and a lot of local regional health authorities have worked very hard to intervene. And in fact, our numbers have improved a fair bit, down 20, 30, 40% in terms of overdose deaths. And they do that with harm reduction, right? With safe injection sites, with the take-home naloxone kits, so people can inject the antidote. With more enhanced, we have a lot of addiction specialists who are trained doctors who are experts, world experts in addictions. And then we have the substitute opioids. It used to be methadone. Now we have Suboxone, which is a much safer substitute. So with all these different pronged approach, we've made a difference. And so, and that's important to know. But the message, and it came out after the book, is that unfortunately COVID has set all of this progress back. We had a record number of overdoses in March, and partly is understandably the world is so consumed with COVID. Partly it's the drug supply is so tainted because they don't have their regular suppliers, so the quality control is even worse than usual. And ironically, it's partly the users didn't want to use in groups or in safe injection sites because they were worried about catching COVID, so they used alone. And your risk of dying alone when you use versus a 28-year-old dying of COVID is, it's in the millions, of exponentially different. But so we've lost some ground, but good things are being done. But people, it starts with awareness, and it starts with empathy and understanding, and not blaming people and not stigmatizing people.
My goodness, that's such a terrible image that you just drew. You know, I read the book twice. I read it a couple months ago when you and I had an event together,
Yeah.
and then I read it this weekend again, and it was really interesting to read it post COVID, or it's not post COVID, during the COVID era. First of all, the main character, who is a physician and sort of an investigator, Julie, I kept picturing her as Bonnie Henry. Um, but
I never
also
once did.
but also it was really I did it was impossible for me to separate the two. And now, I mean, I think it's impossible to view anything right now that you're consuming through a lens that does not include this pandemic that we're dealing with. um, and your life is certainly crisscrossing both. Are you able to write right now while you're dealing with work and what's happening at the hospital?
No, but fortunately, I finished the manuscript for my next novel, and so I'm doing some minor edits on that, going back and forth. So no, it's been honestly as because I'm department head at St. Paul's for emergency. The month of March, I was supposed to be on sabbatical. It was going to be a big writing month, like you. We were both going to be writing somewhere, but it was probably the most exhausting, overwhelming month from an administrative point of view, as we were just trying to figure out how we were going to respond. We just didn't know. I mean, just as much as the public was scared, we were terrified in the hospital. So it was just all consuming. And it's so nice to talk with you about something else, because I'm going out of my mind talking about COVID for the last, and living it for the last 2 months.
Well, that's the worst segue ever, because now I wanted to talk to you about your
I'll do it for 15
pandemic
more
books.
minutes, but
Sorry, Dan.
all right.
um, so your first novel was Pandemic, right? And that was inspired by the SARS outbreak.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you
Sure.
began writing?
Well, I can tell you the moment that I had the idea for the book, I was sitting in a SARS task force meeting, and somebody put up a map of where SARS was in the world. And it was like in Singapore and Paris and in Tokyo and in Toronto. And it just made no geographic sense to me. And I turned to the person beside me and said, this spread is so unusual. How do we know somebody isn't doing this deliberately? And so that planted the idea for me that what if terrorists, in this case it was Islamic extremists, in the fictional case of mine, decided to try to use a new bird flu as a weapon and infect themselves and infect other people as human suicide bombers and spread it. And, back then it was only, 3 or 4 years after 9/11, and it was all very fresh in our minds. And so was SARS. So it seemed like the perfect idea of a bioweapon with a SARS-like virus. So that's exactly how it came to be.
And then, interestingly, in We All Fall Down, which came out last year, it also deals with a pandemic. It's the return of the Black Death, the plague, I guess. And you go out of your way to address the issue of Islamophobia and of racism when it comes to these issues, because historically, the Black Death was linked to Jews. There was an anti-Semitic aspect to it. In your book, it's an anti-Islam rage that happens, and now we're seeing it. We are seeing an anti-Asian, horrific, from Brian Adams to these horrible people on the street attacking older Chinese people. What do you think about that?
Well, no, I mean, you're absolutely right. And just to be clear, you're right. And We All Fall Down, which went back and forth between the medieval times and the present times. But early on in the recurrence of the Black Death in Italy in the present time, people had a few Islamic extremists or presumed Islamic extremists come under suspicion. It's a total red herring. They have nothing to do with it. But it launches this wave of Islamophobia and violence against, some Muslims in Italy, and And then I compare and contrast that to the fact that tens of thousands of Jews were burned at the stake during the Black Death because they were blamed for instigating the Black Death in certain towns and cities. So it's incredible. You know, the one of the things.
Sorry.
That.
I live near a fire
Oh
station.
yeah.
That was unplanned.
No, it's good. It adds a little drama. But what I was going to say is that, you know, one of the things I've learned, because I've become somewhat of a student of pandemics. I've written about this Black Death. I've also written about the Spanish flu. And uh, the one thing that pandemics seem to do is bring out the extremes of people, you know, and you see the horrific intolerance and those acts, which are just despicable that you cite. And then there's this incredible bravery, you know, I'm seeing I've never been more proud of the medical profession, particularly in places like Italy and New York, where hundreds of doctors and nurses are dying. And they're, you know, I've used the comparison that they're running into the burning building, not away from it. And just the charity, like people bringing food and even people who are undergoing hard economic times. I had a locksmith, you know, whose business he was saying was way down. And as soon as he found out I worked in the hospital, he insisted on taking 40% off my bill. Like just because, and he's the same guy that's raising food to bring to the hospitals and stuff. It just all of these little beautiful acts of generosity and courage and stuff. And it's amazing that people both rise and fall to the occasion with things like a pandemic.
What are those 7 p.m. Cheer fests like for you?
They're great. The first couple I heard, I actually got choked up. It's just, it seems like, and I wouldn't have expected to be so affected by it, but to see, to see people line up and you can hear it all over. And whenever we're at St. Paul's, we hear it. It's so loud downtown. It's just, you just get this feeling like, the public is on your side. They have your back. They understand that you're on the front lines, and it's special.
I'm glad to hear that. I'm going to go to some questions that we receive from readers. The first question is from Carol, and she writes, do you believe that there are a few questions here, but I'll read the whole thing and then you can respond. Sure. Do you believe that only a vaccination will end this pandemic? What are the odds of another pandemic in the near future? Will eliminating wet markets help to avoid a similar one? Is our Medicare system and the will of the bureaucrats and policymakers up to the challenge of better managing future pandemics, or does it need a major overhaul? Just a tiny question there from Carol.
Oh, Carol, good questions, Carol. No, but unfortunately, my poorest memory. Let's start. Wet markets. Yeah, I don't think there's any place in this world for wet markets when we know how unstable these viruses are when they can cross-pollinate between species. It's ridiculous. And as much as, I actually admire in many ways the Chinese response to the pandemic once they publicized it. I mean, I think there was a bit of delay, but I'm not critical at all of that. But the fact that I don't think there should be any wet markets, so that's an easy one.
Do you believe that only? Oh, sorry, go ahead. I was going to reread the questions. Do you believe that only a vaccination will end the pandemic?
Probably. I do believe that we will have a couple things. I do believe that, HIV was an interesting thing because I lived through that. And when I started my career, it was a death sentence, right? And there was people could survive a few years, but people died. And now it's just a chronic disease that people live with and have normal lifespan. And what happened, what made the difference was cocktails of triple therapies. There was no one medication that stopped HIV. They needed 3, 4 medications at the same time to contain the virus. And I think my gut feeling tells me that some kind of cocktail of medications, passive antibodies, remdesivir, and some other medications are going to be the answer. I think in the next 6 months, before we have a vaccine, we'll see much better treatment for the sickest patients. I'm hopeful. There's so many brilliant minds working on it. I'm hopeful that'll happen. I think in the long run, it will take a vaccine, because for us to reach herd immunity, you have to get 70 to 80% of the population already infected. And even in New York, where it's been so hard hit, they estimate only 20% of the population has been infected. And you can see the damage then. We can't afford to let 70% of our community, we'd lose so many of our seniors, so many of our people with chronic illness. So I think the vaccine is the ultimate answer. My expectation is the next year and a half is going to be this weird intermittent stage of social distancing and then relaxing the regulations. And when the virus comes back a bit, we start more social distancing. And I think we're going to get used to that new reality. A lot more of this, Marsha, even though you and I aren't necessarily experts on Zoom. I think we will be in a year, but yeah, so that's that. What was the other question?
What are the odds of another pandemic in the near future?
Oh,
Carol, you're very dark.
I know, Carol. Where's the softball, Carol? Yeah, I mean, it's like saying, what are the chances of there being another earthquake? Of course, there's going to be another earthquake. How near in the future, I don't know. And then there's mild pandemics. H1N1 was a pandemic. It just didn't do much damage, right? There's degrees of pandemic. This is the worst we've seen since the Spanish flu. So maybe we'll get a break. Maybe we won't. Maybe we'll get another severe one in 5 years. I do think we will be much more prepared. I don't think people will forget this time. I think we've had it so easy from the respiratory pandemic point of view for the last 30, 40 years that I think a lot of people let their guard down. I don't think that'll happen. I think this will be burned into our memory and we'll all be preparing for the next pandemic much better.
Okay, the next question is from Jacqueline or Jacqueline. I'm a big fan of all his books and so looking forward to reading his latest one. But I'd like to ask Mr. Dan Kalla, that would be Dr. Dan Kalla, how he's dealing with working as a physician in the ER at St. Paul's and still finding time to write such amazing books.
No, thank you, Jacqueline. I think I know.
Oh, and wait, it's quite a long thing, sorry, but she says that she personally finds all of your books absolutely worthy of being turned into movies. Has that been something that's come across your desk?
Yeah, it slid right across my desk several times. I mean, I felt at times like it's been close to happening, and now I never count on that because there's been a lot of talk. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of Jacqueline said. People always ask me, it's the number one question I get asked is where do I find the time? You know, that old adage about if you want something done, give it to a busy person. I don't know if that's always true, but for me it is. If I have 6 things to do, chances are I'll get 5 of them done. But you give me one thing to do, I'll never get that done. I become a massive procrastinator. So I need my 2 careers to, I think the writing makes me a more sensitive doctor. I think it de-stresses me and helps me at work. And I know that I wouldn't be able to write as much as I do without still practicing emergency medicine. They really are very complementary.
The next question is from Susan, and it's also about work-life balance, how you manage it. Do you do anything other than work at the hospital and write your books? Do you have any fun, Dan?
No, not since about 1997. No, I have total fun. I have 2 grown daughters. I have, I used to be, I used to love playing tennis and skiing. I can be, people don't believe this, but I can be lazy as all get out. I watch a ton of Netflix. I love to read. I'm not the fastest reader, so I can't consume books. But yeah, my life is very full and very busy. I write in real fits and spurts. And fortunately, when I do write, for whatever reason, I write very, I'm efficient. I don't know how else to describe it. When I get momentum after I get into a story, I mean, I can be very slow to write the first 3, 4 chapters. But by the time I'm at chapter 10 and I know where I want to go, the book sometimes, like the last page, just poured out of me. I couldn't believe it. I didn't know, I didn't really know the whodunit part until I was 2/3 of the way through. I didn't know where the characters came from. And yet it just felt so organic. And I'm so proud of the way the story turned out that way. Like, I didn't go in, as I said, with any kind of master conspiracy or any great McMuffin moment that was going to change everything. And yet I still feel, well, you read it. I shouldn't be blowing my own horn about this, but I still feel that the mystery, the criminal element worked out as well as anyone that I've ever tried to write in a novel before.
I'm more interested in the use of the term that you just used, great McMuffin moment. Is that a thing?
I don't know if isn't that when you get the big surprise in the ultimate, isn't that
maybe it has eluded me so far.
Yeah.
That was an excellent segue into the next question from Paul. Do you outline your novels ahead of time? And if not, how much have you worked out in your head before you start writing? And when working on a novel, how many words do you write in a day? And then he asks about working at St. Paul's during the pandemic, which I think we've covered.
Yeah, so good question, Paul. I always have an outline, but it's always brief. At most, probably the longest outline I've had was 7 or 8 pages, and that was for my Shanghai trilogy and it really covered the whole trilogy. Usually I work from a 2 or 3 page outline. I don't generally know the characters very well. I have a sense of who the central characters are. I never know who the secondary characters are till I start writing, and that's when I get my most joy, usually from the secondary characters. And I love that. I don't have a set pattern. I keep notes as I'm trying to go ahead. I know what I want to establish in upcoming chapters. I have these notes that would make no sense to anybody else but me, and I write anywhere from 5 words a day or less to 3,000 words on the best day, or 4,000 words some days when it's going on. There's days when I've written for 16 hours, and I don't put expectations on myself. I can't, because I never meet them.
Okay, now we've got some questions that are coming in on the live chat. Tara wants to know, with 2 demanding careers that seem to overlap and integrate, how do you manage to do both at such a highly successful level? Do you think they feed into each other? Do you think you're a better doctor because you're a writer, and a better writer because you're a doctor?
Well, yeah, but it's presumptuous of me to say I do either very successfully. I'm not.
Well, Tara says so, so it must be so.
Take it from Tara, but I don't want to take that assumption. I think for sure. I think they help a lot, and I actually think, surprisingly, having some creativity in terms of writing has helped me be a little more flexible in my approach to medicine, and certainly my research, because I like to be medically accurate. So I learn, believe it or not, when I'm writing novels, I learn a lot of medicine, some of which I can apply to my practice. And so, yeah, I honestly think the two complement each other. And it's not so much, it prevents the burnout. Emergency medicine can have a very high burnout rate. And having this outlet really keeps me, sometimes I'm just, once I've really gone to the wall on a novel, especially when I'm finishing the last half of the first manuscript and it's all consuming, I love getting away and getting back to work and talking to people and my colleagues, and because the emergency side is much more social than the writing side.
All right, here's a question from JG Chaco. We always write what we know. How much of yourself ends up in your characters?
That's a good question, a very tough question for me to answer. I always thought that I avoided, when I first started writing and was learning how to write stories, I would try to base them on people I knew or put aspects of myself. And I found that it wasn't very good. They all ended up like caricatures. So I now don't think about somebody or don't base characters on people I know. But it's really interesting. My Shanghai trilogy, the hero is a doctor called Franz Adler, who escapes to Shanghai with his young daughter, and he's a surgeon. And my cousin, my dad died just around the time that the first book came out. And my cousin said, "That's so nice that you wrote about your dad." I said, "What are you talking about? I never write about." And he goes, "Well, your dad's name was Frank, wasn't it?" And yeah, and your character's Franz. Your dad was a surgeon, wasn't he? Yeah. Your dad escaped from, he didn't go to Shanghai, but, and your dad was a pretty stubborn, relatively pig-headed, very moralistic, and just everything. And I realized he was all in there. And, I really was writing about my dad, and I had no idea. So I don't consciously do it, but of course it comes out. You can't help write what you know, even when you're writing something that you think is totally foreign to you. And I don't think you'd never find your voice, and readers would never buy it if you didn't put some of yourself in what you write.
Okay, next question. Can you talk about whether or how your writing process has changed since the first book? That's a good question.
It's a good question.
They're all good questions.
Interestingly, I think I'm more critical of my writing. My first book, I thought was brilliant. And I thought, I didn't really think it was brilliant, but I thought I accepted so much, less in terms of my own standard of perfection, because I was just so excited. I had a novel, I had a beginning, I had an end, and so now I'm very conscious of, like you said, it's my 11th book. I hate sounding like I'm repeating myself. I hate using any of the same phrases or even dialogue tags, or I mean, obviously you can't avoid it. So in some ways, I'm much more analytical and have a higher I wouldn't say higher standard. I just judge myself more as a writer now. But other things just come naturally to me. I don't have to think about. I know how to set up a scene. I know the fundamentals of at least the way I write. If I need an action scene, if I need a contemplative scene, if I, it feels very organic to me, and I'm, I, I, I do it more subconsciously, I would say now.
Okay, final question is from Kathy. As you write, do you consciously think about the impact your books may have on public perceptions of marginalized people? Is that purposeful? If so, do you feel they worked?
Yeah, that's a good question, Kathy. I don't think I've ever, I've had a few books with marginalized people in, but never more so than this novel. And I have no idea what the impact is on public perception. But whatever little audience I have, whatever little opportunity I have, both in my book and then when I'm talking about my book, I really try to convey the message that, people are people. There's good and bad amongst marginalized people. There's good and bad amongst the highest echelon of society, and people should not be judged for that. And, particularly with this whole issue of addiction. Um, and, like you started off this conversation saying, Marsha, it's easy to look and say that's them, and that's not really part of our world, but it is. And people you know and love are at risk of of even falling into that same state. And so I hope people realize, and I hope I can convey the message that you know most of the time, be it a pandemic or an opioid crisis, it's the marginalized people who usually pay the highest price and take the highest brunt of it. So I really would like to convey some sympathy and empathy for what they go through.
Well, thanks for that. That is something that, that's one of the things that keeps me up at night. And there's a long list, but that's one of them. And I don't want to live in a society where it's that us and them,
Yeah.
although perhaps that's naive of me. What a way to end, Marsha. Dan, it was really great. Thank you so much for writing these books, but mostly thank you for running the emergency department at St. Paul's during a pandemic and otherwise. And please tell all the healthcare workers and the people who clean the floors and care for everyone that we are thankful.
Yeah, I will do. And thank you. Well, first of all, thank you, Marsha. I know it's very kind to have someone of your talent and skill and interviewing me. It's always an honor, and we've got to do it now twice in 2 months, so I really appreciate that. But I think that's a good message to end on. It's everybody. It's not the doctors and just the nurses. Everybody playing their part at the hospital, and that's what's nice about that cheer and everything else. They're all frontline workers. They're all taking the same risk, and they're all doing what they can to make a difference.
Okay, I want to just plug a couple of websites. Yours is danielkalla.com, and Kalla is spelled Kalla. And the Vancouver Writers Fest is writersfest.bc.ca. And thank you to Clea Young and Leslie Herdig at the Writers Fest for putting this on and offering people a conversation in a very weird time. Thank goodness for books, because they're getting me through this. Dan, all the best to you. Anyone who's watching, thank you for watching. And everybody, please stay safe. Bye now.